Matthew Wallace is a senior program specialist at the International Development Research Center in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, where he manages programming in the Education and Science Division, focusing primarily on strengthening science systems in Latin America and Africa. Matthew has a master's degree in physics and in science and technology studies, as well as a PhD in history. His research previously focused on the evolution of scientific disciplines, science policy, and research evaluation. He has also worked as a policy advisor and evaluator at Environment and Climate Change Canada and at the Canada Foundation for Innovation. So Matt, take it away.
Thanks very much, Jamie. So I apologize. I decided to go slideless as a bit of an experiment, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully I can keep things sort of structured and coherent, and I'm happy to share some of my notes later on if that's useful. So yeah, I mean, a bit of context. So I'm kind of a lapsed STS history of science scholar, so maybe a bit of a fish out of water, but hopefully I'll try to bring a few perspectives that come more from working in a funding organization like IDRC. IDRC, for those of you who don't know it, is part of Canada's kind of global assistance family, for lack of a better expression, that funds research for development. So funding research mostly based in the global south. And so my points come from not so much from original research, but more from synthesizing some of the work that we support a little bit everywhere, right, around the world, but especially Africa and Latin America. And also from some research that I did do a few years ago related to kind of agenda setting in the context of avian flu, and trying to understand how decisions were made. So I think basically just trying to draw on some of that. So, I mean, I think, you know, many people are sort of arguing that the pandemic is radically changing how science is done, how science is perceived. I think, you know, whether or not that's the case remains to be seen. I think it has increased calls for, you know, more open science, access to publications, access to data. Some think this might, you know, renew trust in science, trust in scientific evidence, and some, you know, have argued that it's the opposite, that the pandemic is putting more of a strain on this, you know, maybe a broken contract between science and society. But in any case, I think it's placed some scrutiny on how science is funded, you know, on how science is done, how long it takes, how it's reviewed, et cetera, and obviously raise some ethical questions. What I'm interested in here is that I think the pandemic has, you know, a lot has been accompanied by this discourse of, you know, international collaboration. And, you know, we're dealing with a global pandemic, it can't be treated in isolation, and so on and so forth. And that there's a need for, you know, countries to come together to collaborate. And there's a need for countries to have the ability to, you know, undertake their own research, data collection, and make their own decisions about how to manage the pandemic. So those are sort of the two key assumptions that underpin my remarks. And I think the challenge is that this point on, you know, international collaboration, you know, the dynamics of that collaboration in a way determine how the pandemic is treated. And it's true for, you know, research on control mechanisms, as well as research on, you know, as well as vaccine development in very different ways, and the many different kind of outcomes that people are pursuing to fight the pandemic. But the question is, what are the real kind of barriers to collectively working towards these shared objectives? And to what degree do research organizations, particularly in the Global South, really have flexibility or agency to change how they're working and to be more collaborative, to you know, influence a global discourse, especially. And so I think the main hurdle in this regard, or one of the main hurdles, is the inability of governments in the Global South to actually dictate or to influence their own research priorities. And so you have tensions between, what nationally people would say are research priorities and the kind of more pervasive incentive structures, both from the private sector, but also, I would argue, as much, if not even more, from the kind of public science enterprise. And that when we have this kind of situation where there isn't that sort of priority setting activity, or very difficult priority setting activity from governments, for example, in the global south, and that kind of leads to a lack of diversity in the type of research that's done, and then a lack of, basically like a closing down of the types of options that we're considering and the types of evidence that are being considered to fight the global pandemic, which I think is unfortunate in a way. So basically in this talk, I'll just unpack a little bit what I just said, and then make a few small comments about how we can move forward from a funder's perspective, and what funders who work globally, and especially in the global south, can do to change this to some degree. So I think the notion of research prioritization is really fundamental to what we call science diplomacy, and what should be the kind of global science community. So when we talk about international collaboration, especially North and South working together, and I think this is really echoing what the last speaker just said, we're not just talking about sort of fewer resources in the global south to do science versus more resources in the global north. I think we really need to first acknowledge and identify some of the more fundamental systemic inequalities in research on a global scale. And that means access to infrastructure, access to the outputs of research, for example, in the publishing world, an ability to influence global research agendas, and obviously when we talk about the vaccine, access to the more tangible outputs of research as well. And I think what some of the research we've supported has looked at is, as for example, funding flows. And then, when you look at what type of research, for example, is done in the global south, and you try to interrogate, why you have more researchers working on topic X versus topic Y, I think initially you think, well, this is what's interesting and this is what's relevant. But I think tracing it back, in many cases, those decisions, and as Manuela also said, those decisions don't come from their national context or even their regional context, but are really pushed from the global north. Often, in the context of biomedical science, we're talking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or the WHO, or the Wellcome Trust. And it's not to say that these aren't important, things to look at. For example, when Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation looks at malaria, or the Wellcome Trust focuses on a certain country, decides that HIV/AIDS is something that is worth researching. But I think it's just important to acknowledge that how these decisions are made. And I think when you extrapolate that to the pandemic, we can ask some of those same questions. Why is this approach to the pandemic being researched more than that approach? Why is a certain type of treatment being studied rather than, for example, certain control measures, for example, or detection technologies or things like that. So, excuse me. So I think these are some of the questions that, especially in the global south, kind of remain hidden. And the second point is that I think there's also an opportunity to unpack the political economy of science and of science advice within countries in the global south. What is the interplay between ministries, science agencies, academies, universities that kind of affect how decisions are made? And I think Sergio's example of R&D tax credits, for example, is a good one. How does this come to be, and where do the power structures lie that say, well, we need to, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, governments agreed a little while ago that they should all spend 1% of their GDP on research and development, and obviously this is very difficult to achieve. But who, of the ones that have taken steps, why have they taken these steps, and where have the key sort of organizations lobbied in different ways, and how has this come together as a kind of national science policy? So I think this is sort of an interesting way to approach how decisions are made in terms of science prioritization at a national level. And concretely, I mean, what IDRC works on quite a bit is trying to develop a basis for working with some of these structures, in particular science granting agencies, national science granting agencies, and trying to understand how their relationships with the political powers are, and how their relationships with regional organizations or even global organizations operate, and how. So in the context of the global pandemic, where do they see, where do they get their information? How do they set their research agenda, and so forth? And on the flip side, when we talk about the political economy, we're also talking about the notion of science advice, and how do countries, as they define their own policy, public health policy priorities, how do they get their information, and to what degree they're using local research versus international research versus relying on the advice of the WHO, or in the case of Africa, the Africa Center for Disease Control, or some of those organizations. And I think we're only starting to understand a little bit how this is working. One of the organizations we work with is called the International Network on Government Science Advice, and they're, I think, trying to unpack this in countries in the global south, which often just kind of remains hidden. And the final thing that I'll mention is, and this is not sort of specific to the global south, but I think it's in a way exacerbated there, is trying to understand how the sort of scientific norms are defined, and one of the examples is research excellence, and we've done a little bit of work with some colleagues in Latin America and Asia and Africa. There's a book that I co-edited that came out earlier this year about kind of rethinking research excellence from a global south perspective, and this idea that this is what drives science in most countries, north and south, but trying to question some of the assumptions and some of the what I would say kind of hidden origins of research excellence. So some would argue that this is just kind of a push for high quality science, which I think makes sense. Some would argue that it's kind of a neo-colonial agenda, where you have what's attached to a notion like research excellence is, for example, male dominated, or it comes from the way Europe or North America has decided to treat research and has decided to implement science policy, but it might not, basically it's being transposed in other contexts where maybe something else works better, right? Some other type of language or some other type of approach to funding research. And so, for example, when, going back to the case of avian flu many years ago, when I was interrogating researchers, interviewing researchers in Europe and North America about why they make certain decisions and policymakers as well about why they fund certain types of research over others. This idea, for example, of research excellence kind of came out. Well, some fields of research are inherently more excellent than others. We talk about biomedical fields, and this came out in the same way that they feel this pressure to collaborate with big pharma. So I think trying to understand some of those both public and private agencies and how they take place, especially in the global south, is important. So those were kind of the basic things I wanted to unpack in terms of understand, in terms of just sort of acknowledging some of those, global, for lack of a better word, kind of, barriers to kind of global collaboration, and how funders should can sort of help address these rather than exacerbate them in the context of COVID-19, for example. And the last thing I'll close, I think there are solutions, and in the UK, there was a couple of very damning reports on two very large funding initiatives, the Global Challenges Research Fund and the Newton Fund, that these were basically not, designed, even though they were part of the overseas assistance envelope, they were not actually being used in that way, and they weren't kind of benefiting in that way because they weren't really engaging scientists from the global south in the process of making decisions and in the process of setting priorities. So I think one of the roles of funding agencies is to kind of allow some of that agency to happen within the global south and to build capacity for that to happen. And so that kind of fundamental capacity strengthening for granting agencies and for science academies to actually play that role and to be negotiators on the global scale is very important. So I think that's where democratic or somewhat democratic institutions, despite all their flaws, have a much bigger role to play in setting the global research agenda, and especially in the case of COVID-19, where we really need this diversity of voices to provide advice, to enable vaccine development, and to basically act as effective science diplomats. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.